Imagine standing at the edge of thought itself, where concepts refuse to stay still, where identity dissolves into pure difference, where the very ground beneath philosophical inquiry becomes fluid, volcanic, alive. This is the intellectual territory of Gilles Deleuze, a French philosopher who dared to ask not what things are, but what they can become. On November 4th, 1995, suffering from severe respiratory illness that had plagued him for decades, Deleuze threw himself from the window of his Paris apartment. He was 70 years old. His death was as uncompromising as his philosophy, a final refusal of the organized body, a last gesture of escape from what he and his collaborator Felix Guattari had called the stratifications that imprison us. But the ideas he left behind continue to proliferate, to mutate, to create new connections across disciplines that range from film theory to neuroscience, from political activism to architecture, from literature to digital technology. Michel Foucault, perhaps the only French philosopher of comparable stature in the late 20th century, once declared in 1970 that perhaps one day the century would be called Deleuzian, though Foucault later clarified that he meant this somewhat ironically, referring to how Deleuze's difficult ideas might eventually penetrate common opinion. The prophecy has proven partially true. Today, Deleuze remains one of the most cited authors in the humanities, his concepts appearing everywhere from academic conferences to underground music scenes, from revolutionary political movements to discussions about artificial intelligence and networked culture. What makes Deleuze so persistently relevant, so maddeningly difficult, and yet so strangely liberating? Unlike many philosophers who offer systems of stability, Deleuze offers us a philosophy of transformation. He teaches us to think not in terms of what is, but in terms of what is becoming, not in terms of fixed identities, but in terms of the differences that produce those identities, only to immediately undermine them. Not in terms of trees with their roots and hierarchies, but in terms of rhizomes, those underground stem systems that spread horizontally, connecting any point to any other point, refusing central organization, regenerating themselves when broken. His philosophy is not about finding truth, but about creating concepts that open new possibilities for living, thinking, and acting in the world. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore the labyrinthine brilliance of Deleuze's thought, from his early studies of other philosophers to his explosive collaboration with the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari, from his radical reconception of desire and the unconscious to his visionary analyses of cinema and art, and finally to his lasting influence on how we understand power, creativity, and resistance in the 21st century. Gilles Deleuze was born in 1925 in Paris, coming of age during the Second World War and the German occupation of France. He studied philosophy at the Sorbonne in the late 1940s, earning his aggregation in 1948, but remained outside the mainstream academic establishment for decades, teaching at provincial universities until finally receiving a position at the Experimental University of Paris VIII at Vincennes in 1969. His major doctoral thesis, Difference and Repetition, wasn't published until 1968, when he was already 43 years old. From his youth, Deleuze suffered from severe respiratory problems that would eventually destroy his lungs, forcing him to rely on a tracheotomy and making speech increasingly difficult in his final years. But the biographical details matter less than the intellectual atmosphere in which Deleuze worked. Post-war French philosophy was dominated by three powerful currents. First, phenomenology, imported from Germany through Husserl and Heidegger, which focused on how consciousness experiences and constitutes the world. Second, existentialism, particularly in its Sartrean form, which emphasized human freedom, choice, and the burden of creating meaning in an absurd universe. Third, structural analysis, which sought to uncover the underlying systems and codes that organize language, culture, and the unconscious mind, championed by figures like Claude Lévi-Strauss in anthropology, Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis, and Louis Althusser in Marxist theory. Deleuze positioned himself against all three movements while learning from each. Against phenomenology, he rejected the centrality of consciousness and the subject, insisting that thought emerges from encounters with forces outside it. Against existentialism, he refused the drama of individual choice and authentic selfhood, proposing instead that we are multiplicities, assemblages of impersonal forces and flows. Against structuralism, he denied that hidden codes and symbolic orders determine reality, arguing instead for a philosophy of production, of genesis, of how the new actually emerges rather than how existing forms reproduce themselves. The political upheavals of May 1968, when student protests and worker strikes nearly toppled the French government, profoundly shaped Deleuze's mature philosophy. The events demonstrated that revolutionary transformation could erupt from below, from molecular desires and connections, rather than from organized party structures or ideological programs. This insight would become central to his collaboration with Felix Guattari, a practicing psychoanalyst and political activist, 15 years his junior. Together, they would develop a philosophy that tried to think at the level of intensity, of becoming, of the forces that produce rather than the forms that result. They would create a conceptual vocabulary strange enough to match the strangeness of reality itself. Before Deleuze wrote anything under his own name, before he announced his own philosophical position, he spent nearly 15 years studying what he called a minor tradition in philosophy, a counter-tradition running beneath the major figures everyone was supposed to read, while his contemporaries in the prestigious École Normale Supérieure studied Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger, the three H's that dominated French philosophy. Deleuze turned to figures who had been marginalized, misunderstood, or simply forgotten. He wrote books on David Hume, the Scottish empiricist, on Henri Bergson, whose vitalist philosophy had fallen completely out of fashion, on Friedrich Nietzsche, who was still widely dismissed as a literary provocateur rather than a serious philosopher, and most importantly, on Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century Jewish philosopher who had been excommunicated from his community and whose radical monism was still considered dangerously atheistic. What connected these thinkers for Deleuze? They all rejected what he would come to call the image of thought, the unquestioned assumptions that had dominated philosophy since Plato. This image assumes that thinking is natural to us, that we have a good will toward truth, that we possess a method for attaining it. That error comes merely from external influences that lead us astray, and that truth itself is inherently recognizable when we find it. Deleuze's minor tradition insisted on the opposite, that thinking is not natural, but must be provoked by an encounter with something that forces us to think, that there is no pre-established harmony between thought and truth, that problems are more important than solutions, and that philosophy's task is not to discover pre-existing truths, but to create new concepts that allow us to think differently. In Spinoza, Deleuze found a philosopher of absolute immanence, someone who refused all transcendence, all appeal to anything beyond or outside the world itself. Spinoza's ethics demonstrated univocity in ontology, the idea that being is said in only one sense, meaning God or nature or substance are not separate hierarchical levels, but one single plane on which everything exists as modifications or expressions. There is no world beyond this one, no realm of forms or essences, no transcendent judge evaluating our actions from outside. Everything that exists is a mode of the one substance, differing not in kind, but only in degree of power or capacity to affect and be affected. Deleuze emphasized how Spinoza replaced morality, which refers existence to transcendent values representing God's judgment, with ethics understood as a typology of immanent modes of existence. The question is never what is morally good or evil according to some external standard, but rather what increases or decreases our power to act. What compositions between bodies enhance life, and what decompositions poison it. Spinoza's cry echoed through Deleuze's work. We do not know what a body can do. A challenge to stop privileging consciousness and instead explore the body as a model for understanding capacities, forces, and becomings. From Bergson, Deleuze inherited concepts that would become central to his own work: virtuality and multiplicity, duration and memory, the creative evolution that produces genuine novelty rather than merely rearranging pre-existing elements. Bergson had fought against the spatialization of time, the reduction of duration to measurable instants arranged on a line. Real time, Bergsonian duration, is heterogeneous and indivisible, a continuous flow where past, present, and future interpenetrate rather than succeed each other as discrete moments. The past doesn't cease to exist when the present arrives. Rather, the past is preserved in its entirety, coexisting virtually with the actual present and contracted into it. Memory is not storage, but coexistence. Deleuze's engagement with Bergson was effectively formed in the mid-1950s, well before his texts on Nietzsche and Spinoza, and these works were fundamentally Bergsonian-inspired. The Bergsonian distinction between the virtual and the actual would provide Deleuze with a way to think about how the new emerges, how potentials become realized not through mechanical causation, but through creative differentiation. Nietzsche gave Deleuze a genealogical method and a principle of difference understood as will to power. Genealogy constituted Nietzsche's genetic method, bringing critique to bear not simply on false claims to knowledge or morality, but on true knowledge and true morality, and indeed on truth itself. Every truth, every value, every moral judgment emerges from configurations of force, from the play of domination and resistance, affirmation and negation. There is no neutral position from which to evaluate. Every perspective expresses the interests of particular forces. Nietzsche's great contribution was to show how reactive forces, those that seek to diminish life, to make it conform to fixed identities and moral absolutes, had triumphed over active forces that affirm becoming and create new values. Deleuze's anti-Hegelianism appeared in his focus on non-dialectical, affirmative differential forces Nietzsche termed noble, forces that affirm themselves and differentiate themselves first, only secondarily considering that from which they have differentiated. Against the Hegelian dialectic, where difference is subordinated to contradiction and negation, Nietzsche offered an affirmation that produces difference without requiring opposition. A yes that doesn't need a no to define itself. These three philosophers, Spinoza, Bergson, and Nietzsche, formed what Deleuze called an unholy trinity, a counter-canon against the dominant tradition. Immanence, duration, affirmation, the parameters of an ontology of difference. From them, Deleuze extracted the tools he needed to develop his own position, what he would call transcendental empiricism, a deliberately paradoxical term that combines Kant's notion of transcendental conditions with empiricism's insistence on staying within experience. Traditional empiricism, in its British form from Locke through Hume, had argued that all knowledge comes from sensory experience, that the mind begins as a blank slate, receiving impressions from outside. Kant had shown the inadequacy of this view. Experience requires organizing principles, categories, and forms of intuition that structure the sensory manifold into coherent objects of knowledge. But Kant located these organizing principles in a transcendental subject standing outside experience, a subject that synthesizes the given according to universal and necessary rules. Kant's question had been, how can the given be given to a subject? While Hume's question had been, how is the subject constituted within the given? Deleuze wanted to reverse Kant's reversal of empiricism, to find the conditions of real experience not in a transcendent subject, but immanent to experience itself. Transcendental empiricism involves an empiricist critique applied to transcendental philosophy, which commits it strongly to experience, while simultaneously applying a transcendental critique to empiricism, which brings to light its philosophical assumptions regarding consciousness. The key is to locate the conditions of experience not in a unified subject, but in an impersonal and pre-individual transcendental field. Subjects emerge as products of differential passive syntheses, patterns of multiple and serial syntheses that fold in on themselves, producing sites of self-awareness. We don't begin with a subject who then has experiences. Rather, the subject is constituted through processes that are prior to it, through what Deleuze calls passive syntheses, operating at the level of habit, memory, and time itself. The body contracts its past experiences into habits before any conscious subject emerges to reflect on those habits. Unconscious synthesis precedes conscious recognition. Transcendental empiricism is concerned with the immanent thought processes that generate our experience of the real, not with transcendent conditions imposed from outside. This means that philosophy must attend to what can only be sensed, to intensities and differences that exceed conceptual recognition. The intense world of difference in which we find reason behind qualities and the being of the sensible is precisely the object of a superior empiricism. Philosophy begins not with what we already know, but with encounters that force us to think, with signs that disrupt our habitual ways of making sense. This brings us to Deleuze's most controversial claim, that concepts must be created, not discovered. Empiricism is by no means a reaction against concepts, but undertakes the most insane creation of concepts ever. Philosophers don't find pre-existing truths waiting to be uncovered. They invent conceptual tools for grasping and transforming experience. A philosophical concept is not a universal essence or a representation of an object, but a singularity, a unique articulation of components that opens new ways of thinking and acting. Concepts are multiplicities, assemblages of heterogeneous elements that enter into relations with other concepts, forming what Deleuze and Guattari would later call a plane of immanence. The greatness of a philosophy lies not in its proximity to truth, but in the power and novelty of the concepts it creates. This is why Deleuze approached the history of philosophy the way he did, not to accurately reproduce what past thinkers said, but to extract from their work the concepts that could be reactivated and transformed for new purposes. He famously described his method as a kind of philosophical encounter from behind, producing monstrous offspring that might scandalize their supposed parents, but that carry forward the creative force of philosophical thought. The implications are radical. If concepts are created rather than discovered, if truth is perspectival rather than absolute, if the subject is produced rather than given, then philosophy becomes essentially an art of invention, a practice of experimentation rather than a science of foundations. This doesn't mean anything goes or that philosophy becomes arbitrary. Creating concept requires rigor and precision, but it's the rigor of construction rather than correspondence, the precision of carpentry rather than mapping. A good concept is one that works, that allows thought to go places it couldn't go before, that connects previously isolated domains, that produces effects in the world. Philosophy, understood this way, becomes a toolbox, a set of conceptual instruments for intervening in reality rather than representing it from a distance. This vision of philosophy as conceptual creation would guide all of Deleuze's subsequent work, from his masterwork, Difference and Repetition, to his collaborations with Guattari and his late books on cinema and literature. Every philosophical act would be measured by one criterion. Does it allow us to think differently, to see new possibilities, to affirm life more powerfully? In 1968, at age 43, Deleuze submitted his principal doctoral thesis, Difference and Repetition, a work that would establish him as a major philosophical voice, and that remains perhaps his most important single contribution to philosophy. The book announced itself with an extraordinary claim that Western philosophy, since Plato, had fundamentally misunderstood both difference and repetition by subordinating them to identity. The entire tradition, Deleuze argued, had treated difference as something that appears between already constituted identities, as a relation of comparison where we say X differs from Y. But what about difference in itself? Difference that doesn't presuppose the things it differentiates? What about the differential processes that produce identities in the first place, rather than merely relating them afterwards? This question drives the entire book, and answering it requires nothing less than overturning the traditional image of thought since Plato. Philosophy had assumed what Deleuze calls the dogmatic image of thought, a set of postulates that seems so natural, so self-evident, that it never gets questioned. This image assumes that thinking is our natural vocation, that we possess goodwill toward truth. That error comes merely from external disturbances rather than from something internal to thought itself. That recognition is thought's primary operation, and that truth has an affinity with thought such that we'll know it when we find it. Everyone knows what it means to think, this tradition assumes. Common sense and good sense guide us naturally toward truth if we just avoid mistakes. Deleuze insists the opposite. Thinking is not natural, but requires violence, a fundamental encounter with something that forces us to think. We don't begin from a serene contemplation of clear ideas, but from a shock, a disruption, something that cannot be recognized by our existing categories, and that therefore compels thought to create new concepts. The philosopher Antonin Artaud understood this when he declared that the problem is not to orient thought or to methodically complete what is already being thought, but to bring into being what does not yet exist. Thought is not the activity of a rational subject calmly applying methods, but an involuntary adventure, a passion provoked by signs that resist comprehension. Learning to swim is Deleuze's favorite example. You don't learn by following verbal instructions or imitating exact movements, but through an encounter with the waves themselves, allowing your body to resonate with the ocean's intensities, composing your movements with forces that are not yourself. The body learns what cannot be represented, adjusting to singularities and rhythms that exceed conscious control. At the heart of difference and repetition lies the distinction between two kinds of difference. Extensive difference, which operates between already formed terms, and intensive difference, which is productive and genetic. Extensive differences are the ordinary differences we recognize and experience. This tree differs from that tree in height. This color differs from that color in hue. This person differs from that person in character. These are representable differences, differences that presuppose identities and can be measured, compared, and organized into conceptual schemes. But intensive differences are another matter entirely. They refer to the pre-individual field of forces and processes that produce extensities in the first place. Intensity is a property that cannot be divided without changing in nature. Temperature exemplifies this perfectly. If you have a volume of water at 90 degrees and divide it in half, you don't get two volumes at 45 degrees. You get two volumes that each remain at 90 degrees. But if you heat the container from below, creating a temperature difference between the top and bottom, something remarkable happens. When the difference reaches a certain threshold, the system undergoes what physicists call a phase transition. The water begins to move in convection patterns, producing extensive spatial properties, visible currents of different sizes and shapes. The intensive difference generates the extensive forms. This is the pattern Deleuze finds everywhere. Intensity produces extensity. The virtual actualizes itself in determinate forms. Difference differentiates itself into diverse beings. The intensive is the genetic principle, the condition for the production of the qualities and extensities that populate our experienced world. But intensity is difficult to grasp because it tends to cancel itself out in its products. When we experience the world, we experience extensive qualities and spatial distinctions, not the intensive processes that generated them. The temperature difference that drove the convection disappears into the visible flow patterns. Intensity operates as a depth that disappears under the surfaces it produces. To think intensity requires what Deleuze calls ideas, but these are radically different from Platonic forms. A Deleuzian idea is not a static essence existing in an intelligible heaven, but a structure of differential relations, a multiplicity. Deleuze borrows from differential calculus to explain an idea consists of differential elements that have no independent existence, differential relations between these elements, and singular points determined by these relations. Consider a hurricane. It forms when intensive processes of air and water movement propelled by temperature and pressure differences reach certain singular points. These singular points, the thresholds where the storm system crystallizes, are not unique to any individual hurricane, but are virtual for all hurricanes. Every actual hurricane shares the same virtual structure, even as each is a singular actualization of that structure, just as the boiling point of water is virtual for every actual pot boiling on a stove. Ideas are multiplicities in Deleuze's technical sense. They are neither one nor many, but composed of dimensions and directions that vary. The idea of color, for instance, is not the general concept under which red, blue, and green are subsumed, but the system of differential relations between wavelengths, intensities, and saturations that can be actualized in infinitely diverse ways, depending on contexts and encounters. An idea is always problematic rather than propositional. It doesn't state what is the case, but poses a field of potential determinations that can be realized differently. Learning involves engaging with these problematic ideas, not acquiring solutions, but entering into the problem itself, inhabiting its intensive field. This brings us to repetition, the book's second major concept. Just as difference had been subordinated to identity, repetition had been understood merely as the mechanical reproduction of the same. When we say something repeats, we usually mean that identical elements succeed each other. Tick, 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 the same sound recurring, but Deleuze distinguishes repetition from generality. In a general series, terms can be exchanged because they instantiate the same law or concept. All equilateral triangles are equivalent for geometrical purposes. Any sample of pure water behaves the same way chemically. Generality is the domain of laws, concepts, and equivalences. Repetition, by contrast, involves irreplaceable singularities. A festival repeats annually, but each occurrence is unique, unrepeatable in its concrete existence. The ritual doesn't reproduce something identical, but returns to a singular event that can never be the same. Repetition is not the repetition of the same, but the return of difference. When you practice a piano piece repeatedly, you're not mechanically reproducing identical performances, but intensifying your relation to the music, allowing your body to resonate more deeply with the composition's singularities. Each repetition differs from every other, and through this difference, something new emerges: mastery, understanding, transformation. Deleuze identifies three syntheses of time that structure repetition. The first synthesis is habit, the passive contraction of successive instants into a living present. Even at the most basic biological level, organisms contract their environments into habits before any conscious subject appears. A plant contracts water and sunlight into its growth. The nervous system contracts stimuli into expectations. This passive synthesis produces the foundation of time as a living present, constantly renewed through organic contractions. But the living present points beyond itself to a second synthesis of memory, where the past is preserved in its entirety, coexisting virtually with the present. Following Bergson, Deleuze argues that the past doesn't follow the present. Rather, the present is constantly passing, constantly becoming past while remaining present. Memory is not storage in the brain, but the virtual coexistence of all past states with the actual present. The third synthesis is the most radical. The future as empty form, as pure caesura or cut that opens time to the genuinely new. This is not the future as a not yet present that will eventually arrive, maintaining continuity with the present, but a future that breaks with all continuity, that introduces an absolute difference. Deleuze invokes Nietzsche's eternal return here, but interprets it in a way that scandalized many Nietzsche scholars. The eternal return does not mean that the same events will recur in an endless cycle. Rather, it selects for return only that which affirms difference itself, only that which can bear to return as different. What returns is not the same, but the power of differing, the pure form of time as becoming. The eternal return is the being of becoming, the way difference itself persists through its actualizations. This leads to one of the book's most provocative claims, that the subject is not a given, but must be produced through processes that exceed and precede it. Traditional philosophy, from Descartes through Kant, had assumed a constituted subject who then has experiences or performs syntheses. But Deleuze's passive syntheses operate before any subject exists, creating the subject as their effect. The I that thinks emerges from larval subjects, from habits and contractions that are pre-personal. Subjectivity is not an origin, but a result, constantly reconstituted through encounters and differential relations. We are not unified selves possessing experiences, but multiplicities traversed by heterogeneous processes, assemblages of incompatible perspectives held together by fragile syntheses. The political implications are immense. If identity is secondary to difference, if subjects are produced rather than given, then nothing about our current forms of existence is necessary or inevitable. We are not condemned to remain what we are, because we were never simply what we appeared to be in the first place. The stabilities we take for granted, the identities that seem so solid, are actually precarious achievements, temporary plateaus and processes of differentiation that never stop. This doesn't mean that anything is possible or that we can simply choose to be different. The intensive processes that constitute us have their own logic, their own singular points and thresholds. But it does mean that transformation is always available, that lines of flight run through every stratum, that new configurations can emerge from engagements with intensities we hadn't noticed. Difference and repetition established Deleuze as a philosopher of production, of genesis, of becoming. Where structuralism looked for hidden codes and invariant rules, where phenomenology described the structures of consciousness, where existentialism celebrated authentic choice, Deleuze proposed a philosophy that stays at the level of the impersonal processes that produce forms, subjects, and meanings. His question was never what things are, but how they come to be. Never what we should choose, but what forces compose our capacity to choose. This shift from being to becoming, from the actual to the virtual, from representation to production, would define all his subsequent work. The concepts he developed in this book, intensity and ideas, difference and repetition, the three syntheses of time, would be taken up and transformed in his collaborations with Guattari, applied to capitalism and psychoanalysis, to art and literature, to cinema and politics. But their fundamental gesture remained constant: to think at the level of forces, processes, and productions, rather than formed things, to affirm the power of difference to create the new, to map the lines along which transformation becomes possible. In 1969, Deleuze met Felix Guattari, a practicing psychoanalyst and political militant who was 15 years his junior. Guattari worked at the experimental psychiatric clinic Laborde, where he pioneered radical approaches to treating psychosis. And he was deeply involved in the revolutionary movements that had exploded across France in May 1968. The collaboration between these two thinkers would produce some of the most explosive and controversial philosophical texts of the 20th century. Their first book together, Anti Oedipus, published in 1972, announced itself as the first volume of a project called Capitalism and Schizophrenia. The title alone was a provocation, linking the dominant economic system of the modern world with what was then considered the most severe form of mental illness. But the link they proposed was not metaphorical. Capitalism and schizophrenia shared a fundamental process: the decoding and deterritorialization of flows. To understand what Deleuze and Guattari meant by this requires grasping their most basic concept: desiring production. This term deliberately crosses Marx with Freud, putting desire into the realm of economic production and production into the realm of unconscious desire. But they're not trying to synthesize these two thinkers in the usual way, where either desire gets explained as sublimated sexuality projected onto social objects, or where psychological problems get reduced to effects of unjust economic structures. Instead, they propose that desiring production is a universal primary process underlying what appear to be separate natural, social, and psychological realms. Desire is not a lack-seeking fulfillment, not a representation of something absent, but productive force itself. The unconscious doesn't lack anything. It produces. It functions as a factory. This is where the concept of desiring machines enters. Machines, in Deleuze and Guattari's vocabulary, are not mechanical devices, but any system that connects flows, cuts them, and produces something from them. Your mouth is a machine that connects to flows of food, air, and speech. Your eye is a machine connecting to flows of light. A breast is a machine that produces milk for a mouth machine to consume. Every machine interrupts a flow and produces something new while connecting to other machines in endless chains. There's no distinction between human machines, natural machines, and technical machines. They all operate according to the same principles of connection, production, and breakthrough. Against the machine stands what they call the body without organs, a concept borrowed from Antonin Artaud. The body without organs is not a literal body, but an intensive field that resists organization into functional parts. Imagine an egg before it develops into an organism with differentiated organs. Or imagine your own experience of lying in bed feeling your body as a continuous surface of sensation, rather than as assembled organs performing specific functions. The body without organs is the unformed, the potential, that which resists being carved up into productive systems. Yet, paradoxically, the body without organs attracts desiring machines, draws them onto its surface, allows them to proliferate even as it resists their organization. Social production works exactly like desiring production. Every society is a machine that organizes flows, flows of people, goods, energy, information, money, and of course, flows of desire itself. These flows must be coded, channeled, regulated. In what Deleuze and Guattari call primitive or territorial societies, coding happens through elaborate systems of kinship, ritual, and myth that determine who can marry whom, who owes what to whom, how goods circulate, and how power operates. Everything is inscribed on the social body, which they identify with the earth itself. The earth codes all flows, marking bodies and things according to their place in the social order. Then comes the despotic or imperial revolution. A despot emerges who overcodes all previous codes, referring everything to his own body as the new Sotius. The emperor's body becomes the surface of inscription, the face that speaks the law. All debts, all obligations, all circulations must pass through this central point. This introduces a new kind of deterritorialization, a lifting of flows from their local codings, but immediately they're re-territorialized on the despot's body. The state apparatus emerges to manage these newly centralized flows, but capitalism represents something unprecedented in human history. It systematically decodes all flows, stripping away the traditional codes that had regulated desire and production. Capitalism dissolves feudal ties, religious obligations, ethnic identities, traditional crafts, local communities. Everything becomes abstract, exchangeable, reducible to monetary value. Money itself is the great decoder, the universal equivalent that allows any flow to connect with any other. Capitalism liberates flows of production, unleashing desiring production to a degree no previous society had allowed. This is its revolutionary aspect, its enormous productive power. Yet capitalism cannot tolerate the flows it releases. Having decoded everything, it must immediately re-territorialize, but now artificially, on what Deleuze and Guattari call axiomatics rather than codes. Where codes are qualitative systems of inscription, axiomatics are quantitative systems of accounting. Capitalism captures decoded flows not by giving them meaning, but by making them calculable, by submitting everything to the axiom of capital accumulation. And crucially, it re-territorializes desire on the private family, on what Freud called the Oedipal triangle, mommy, daddy, and me. This brings us to the book's devastating critique of psychoanalysis. Freud had discovered something genuinely important. The unconscious is real. It operates according to its own logic. It produces our thoughts and actions in ways we don't consciously control. But then, he betrayed this discovery by encoding the unconscious according to a familial romance, reducing all desire to variations on the Oedipal drama. No matter what brings someone to analysis, no matter what their symptoms or complaints, psychoanalysis interprets everything through the family triangle. Your problems with your boss become displaced father issues. Your relationship troubles replay your infantile attachment to your mother. The entire social field of desire gets collapsed into the private nuclear family. Deleuze and Guattari argue this is not a clinical error, but a political operation. The family under capitalism serves as a repressive apparatus that channels revolutionary desire into neurotic forms. Desire in its essence is revolutionary because any genuine desiring production threatens to demolish entire social sectors, to disrupt the established order. Capitalism needs desire to be productive, but cannot tolerate it being fully realized So it delegates to the family the task of binding desire to lack, guilt, and Oedipal scenarios. You don't desire social transformation. You desire mommy. You don't desire the overthrow of authority. You're working through unresolved issues with daddy. Psychoanalysis becomes the spiritual police of capitalism, ensuring that decoded flows of desire get reterritorialized on the safe, private, depoliticized family unit. Against Freudian psychoanalysis, they propose schizoanalysis. The schizophrenic, they insist, is not someone to be cured, but someone who has gone too far in the direction capitalism itself tends. Absolute decoding, absolute deterritorialization. The clinical schizophrenic is what they call the artificial schizophrenic, someone who has crashed at the limits capitalism imposes, unable to reterritorialize. But the schizophrenic process itself, understood outside clinical pathology, reveals something essential about desire. The schizophrenic experiences reality as a field of machines connecting and disconnecting, feels the flows of production directly without the mediation of organized identity or social codes. I become scattered across desiring machines rather than unified in a centered ego. This connects to their famous question, borrowed from Wilhelm Reich, who had asked it about the rise of fascism. Why do people desire their own repression? Why do the masses sometimes rally to fascist movements that clearly oppose their own interests? Why do people fight for their servitude as though it were their salvation? The traditional Marxist answer that they've been fooled by ideology or false consciousness is insufficient. People aren't passively deceived. They actively desire configurations of power that dominate them. This is because desire invests the social field directly, not through the mediation of interests. There are revolutionary investments of desire, and there are reactionary investments, and they don't correspond simply to class position. You can be a worker who desires the triumph of capitalism, or a bourgeois intellectual who desires communist revolution. The unconscious is immediately political, and politics is immediately libidinal. Capitalism operates through what they call decoded flows and deterritorialization on one hand, constantly breaking down barriers and traditional structures to extract surplus value, and artificial reterritorialization on the other hand, through state apparatuses, bureaucracies, police, and especially the family unit that captures desire in Oedipal forms. The system must deterritorialize to function, to maintain its dynamism and expansion, but it must also reterritorialize to prevent complete breakdown. This produces capitalism's inherent instability, its tendency toward crisis, but also its remarkable adaptability. When one mode of reterritorialization fails, capitalism invents new ones. The book's most controversial political gesture involves what they call accelerationism. Though they never use this term, they suggest that perhaps the revolutionary path is not to resist capitalism's deterritorializing tendencies, but to accelerate them, to push them beyond the point where capitalism can reterritorialize them, rather than defending traditional structures against capital's corrosive effects. Perhaps we should go further in the direction of decoding, breaking apart remaining codes until we reach a level of desiring production that exceeds capitalist capture. This has been read by some as a nihilistic embrace of destruction, by others as a sophisticated understanding of how revolutionary transformation must work from within capitalism's own tendencies rather than from an imagined outside. The body without organs becomes their figure for this movement beyond organized forms. Everyone has their own way of making a body without organs, they write, whether through drugs, meditation, erotic practices, or aesthetic experiences. The point is not to destroy organs literally, but to dismantle the organization that subordinates them to a unified organism serving reproduction and social utility. When you dance intensely enough that you lose sense of yourself as a bounded individual and become pure movement, you're making a body without organs. When musicians in free improvisation abandon predetermined structures and respond directly to sonic intensities, they're making a body without organs. The body without organs is not a goal to reach, but a limit to approach. The practice of undoing stratifications. 3 great lines run through everyone's life, they argue. Lines of rigid segmentation that organize us into molar aggregates. You're a worker, a citizen, a family member, someone of a certain age and gender and class. Molecular lines that introduce flexibility and variation within these segments. The micropolitics of small resistances, adaptations, personal styles, and lines of flight that threaten to carry you away from all organization. Moments of absolute deterritorialization that break with everything, that open onto something unforeseeable. Revolutionary politics must operate on all 3 levels simultaneously, using molecular processes to loosen rigid segments while preparing lines of flight that can create genuinely new configurations. Anti Oedipus remains scandalous because it refuses all the comforting narratives philosophy and psychoanalysis offer. It denies that we have stable identities, that families are natural units, that desire aims at wholeness or harmony, that the unconscious speaks a language we can interpret, that therapy heals by helping us accept reality. Instead, it insists that we are assemblages of machines, that the family is a repressive apparatus, that desire is inherently excessive and revolutionary, that the unconscious produces rather than represents, and that health might mean becoming schizophrenic rather than well-adjusted. The book's difficulty comes not from obscure language, though its prose can be dense, but from how radically it asks us to reimagine ourselves, our societies, and the very nature of desire and production. To read Anti Oedipus is to feel the ground of thought itself becoming unstable, which is precisely what Deleuze and Guattari intended. 8 years after Anti Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari published 1,000 Plateaus in 1980, completing their 2-volume project, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. If the first volume was a polemical attack on psychoanalysis and a radical rethinking of desire and capitalism, the second volume became something else entirely. A positive construction, an experimental practice of philosophy that would demonstrate in its very form what rhizomatic thought could be. The book refuses linear organization. It consists of 15 chapters, each called a plateau, and dated with what appears to be a historical year, but which actually signifies a level of intensity. Each plateau can be read independently, in any order, connecting to any other plateau without requiring a predetermined sequence. The book embodies the rhizome it describes. The opening plateau, titled simply Rhizome, introduces the concept that would become Deleuze and Guattari's most widely disseminated idea. A rhizome is a type of underground stem system, like those of potatoes or crabgrass, that spreads horizontally rather than vertically, connecting any point to any other point without passing through a central trunk or root. The rhizome has neither beginning nor end, but always a middle from which it grows and which it overspills. When you break a rhizome, it doesn't die but regenerates from any of its fragments, sprouting new connections in unpredictable directions. This contrasts absolutely with what they call arborescent or tree like structures, which dominate Western thought. Trees have roots that anchor them, a trunk that channels all nutrients upward, branches that divide hierarchically according to binary logic. The tree is genealogical, establishing origins and lineages. It embodies the logic of the one dividing into two, which divides into four, which divides into eight. The endless bifurcations that structure everything from biological taxonomy to computer programming to family trees to philosophical systems that derive multiplicity from an original unity. We're tired of trees, Deleuze and Guattari declare. They've made us suffer too much. The tree imposes the verb to be, establishing fixed essences and identities, while the rhizome operates through the conjunction and proliferating connections without subordinating them to a unified trunk or origin. When you think in trees, you're always looking for foundations, trying to ground knowledge in first principles, seeking the root from which everything else derives. But reality doesn't work that way. The rhizome connects any point to any other point, bringing into play very different regimes of signs and even non-sign states. It's not reducible to one or many, but is composed of dimensions and directions in motion, having neither subject nor object, but only multiplicities defined by the outside, by the lines that traverse them. 6 approximate principles characterize the rhizome: connection and heterogeneity, meaning any point can connect to any other; multiplicity, where there's no subject or object, but only determinations of magnitude and dimension; signifying rupture, meaning when you break it, the rhizome starts up again at any one of its old lines or on new lines; and cartography and decalcomania, meaning the rhizome is oriented toward experimentation with the real rather than reproducing a pre-existing unconscious. A map is open, connectable in all its dimensions, detachable, reversible, susceptible to constant modification. It can be torn, reversed, adapted to any kind of mounting, reworked by an individual, group, or social formation. A tree or root, by contrast, reproduces itself endlessly, always the same structure recurring. The map does not reproduce, it constructs. This distinction between mapping and tracing becomes crucial for understanding what Deleuze and Guattari are attempting. Traditional philosophy produces tracings, reproductions of supposedly eternal structures. Psychoanalysis traces desire back to Oedipal scenarios. Linguistics traces all utterances back to universal grammatical structures. Marxism traces all social relations back to economic-based structures. But these are retroactive projections, imposing order on a chaos that is actually productive. The rhizome, by contrast, maps processes in their emergence, following lines as they develop rather than fitting them into predetermined categories. When you trace, you block becomings. When you map, you allow them to proliferate. The concept of assemblage, or agencement in French, provides the operational unit of rhizomatic analysis. An assemblage is a multiplicity that includes heterogeneous elements: bodies, actions, passions, statements, tools, techniques, organizations. These elements don't combine according to resemblance or analogy, but enter into relations of consistency on a single plane. Your morning routine is an assemblage. Your body, the coffee maker, the newspaper, the clock, habits of movement, the rhythm of waking, the affects of tiredness and anticipation, the memory of yesterday's unfinished tasks. None of these elements is primary. They all function together in a particular configuration that could be dismantled or recombined differently. Every assemblage has two axes. One axis runs between content and expression, between machinic assemblages of bodies and collective assemblages of enunciation. The other axis runs between territorialization and deterritorialization. Territorialization refers to processes that stabilize an assemblage, that give it consistency and recognizable form. You territorialize when you establish habits, routines, when you make a space your own by arranging furniture and decorating. But assemblages also contain lines of deterritorialization that threaten their stability, that push them toward transformation. Your morning assemblage deterritorializes when you oversleep, when the coffee maker breaks, when unexpected news disrupts your routine. And these deterritorializations immediately provoke reterritorializations, new configurations that restabilize differently. A Thousand Plateaus explores countless examples of assemblages across natural history, human culture, and technical systems. The book discusses the wasp and the orchid as a rhizome. The orchid deterritorializes by forming an image of a wasp, but the wasp reterritorializes on this image, while the orchid deterritorializes the wasp by transporting pollen, forming a circuit of parallel evolution. Neither imitates the other. They form a rhizome together, a block of becoming. The same analysis applies to human-animal assemblages, human tool assemblages, social technical assemblages of every kind. The knight and the horse and the stirrup form an assemblage that transforms medieval warfare. The pianist and the piano and the composition form an assemblage that produces music. In each case, you can't understand any element in isolation. You must grasp the assemblage as a whole, the consistency it achieves, the transformations it undergoes. The concept of becoming, introduced in Anti Oedipus but developed systematically in A Thousand Plateaus, operates as the rhizome's mode of temporality. Becoming is not evolution in the Darwinian sense, not a progression from simple to complex, or from ancestral to descendant. Deleuze and Guattari describe becoming as involution, on the condition that involution is in no way confused with regression. Involution involves alliances, contagions, participations across different kingdoms, different species, different registers. When Captain Ahab enters into a becoming whale in Moby Dick, he's not evolving toward being a whale, nor is he regressing to some primitive state, nor is he imitating whales. He's forming a rhizome with the whale, entering into a zone of proximity, where human and whale affect each other, where Ahab's obsession and the whale's elusiveness compose an assemblage that transforms both terms. All becomings are minoritarian. This crucial principle means that becoming always moves away from the molar, away from the majoritarian standard that organizes identities. In relations of power, men constitute the majority, whereas women form a minority, not numerically, but in terms of the standard against which differences are measured. The majoritarian is the abstract standard. Adult, male, white, urban, speaking the standard language, heterosexual, able-bodied. This is nobody in particular, but the norm that defines everyone else as deviant. Becoming minoritarian means escaping this standard, not by claiming a fixed minority identity, but by entering into processes that undo molar identities altogether. This is why all becomings pass through becoming woman, not because women are biologically or essentially different, but because women occupy a minoritarian position relative to the man standard. And this position opens a line of flight for majoritarian organization. But becoming woman is not about imitating women or acquiring feminine traits or transitioning from male to female as fixed categories. From woman as molar identity emerges microfemininity. The idea is to produce in ourselves the molecular woman, to emit particles that enter into relations of movement and rest in the zone of microfemininity. This means escaping the binary opposition of man-woman entirely, finding intensities and becomings that operate below or beside sexual difference as it's socially organized. A man becomes woman not by acting feminine, but by undoing his investment in masculine identity, by finding lines of flight from phallic organization. A woman becomes woman by escaping the identity of woman that patriarchy has imposed, by finding her own lines of variation. From becoming woman, other becomings branch: becoming child, becoming animal, becoming imperceptible. Deleuze and Guattari distinguish three types of animals: the Oedipal animal that is individualized and sentimentalized, the Jungian or archetype animal that has symbolic presence in myths and rituals, and the demonic animal with which becoming animal can occur. The demonic animal is the animal in its multiplicity, in its pack or swarm. When you become animal, you don't identify with a particular pet or totem, but enter into the logic of the pack, the swarm, the multiplicity. Kafka's story Metamorphosis isn't about Gregor Samsa turning into a cockroach. It's about becoming insect, entering into the intensive affects and perceptions of insect existence. The pack of wolves that haunts Freud's Wolfman doesn't symbolize father or represent castration. The wolves are real vectors of becoming that psychoanalysis blocked by Oedipalizing them. Becoming imperceptible is the ultimate becoming, not because it's a final goal, but because it represents the tendency of all becomings. To become imperceptible means to dissolve into the background, to escape all categorization, to achieve a kind of clandestine existence beneath or beside the major codes that organize social visibility. It's what criminals, revolutionaries, artists, and mystics have always practiced. Ways of operating that don't present themselves to power's gaze, that slip through the grid of surveillance and identification. In becoming imperceptible, you don't disappear, but become like everybody, like the world itself, by undoing the particularity that marks you as a target for capture and control. The plateau on the refrain introduces another crucial concept: the territorial motif that produces consistency in chaotic space. Birds sing to establish territory, marking space through repetition that creates a fragile home in the midst of chaos. But the refrain also opens onto the cosmos, carrying territory beyond itself. A child sings in the dark to reassure herself, but the song doesn't just ward off fear. It creates a little world, a portable territory that travels with the singing. Artists and composers work with refrains, taking up existing motifs and variations that lift them from their territories and launch them into new compositions. Miles Davis takes a simple modal structure and through repetition and variation opens it onto an entirely new musical territory. The refrain operates at the junction of three moments: establishing territory, organizing a home, maintaining and consolidating that territory through markers and rhythms, and launching lines of deterritorialization that open onto something beyond the territory itself, onto what Deleuze and Guattari call the cosmos, the intensive forces that exceed all organization. Perhaps the most politically charged plateau is the treatise on nomadology and the war machine. Deleuze and Guattari distinguish between two kinds of science, two kinds of space, two modes of existence, the smooth and the striated. Smooth and striated space differ fundamentally. Striated space is metric, measured, organized by coordinates and fixed points, while smooth space is non-metric, directional, defined by continuous variation. The sea was originally smooth space, navigated by winds, currents, and star positions, but it became striated through longitude and latitude, through maritime law that carved it into territorial waters and shipping lanes. The desert is smooth space for the nomad who moves without fixed routes, following water and pasture. The city is striated space, gridded by streets and property lines, organized by zoning laws and architectural codes. The state apparatus operates by striation, by organizing space according to measure and capture. It establishes sedentary agriculture, fixes populations in place, counts and taxes, and regulates. But exterior to the state is the war machine, which operates in smooth space according to different principles. The war machine is not essentially military. War is rather the supplement the state adds when it appropriates the war machine. In its pure form, the war machine is nomadic. It follows lines of flight. It occupies space without measuring it. It maintains mobility and speed as primary values. Nomads don't lack organization, but their organization is fundamentally different from state organization. They form packs and bands, temporary alliances that can rapidly reconfigure. They prize qualities like speed, agility, and stealth over the state's values of permanence, accumulation, and monumental architecture. This provides a model for revolutionary politics that breaks with both anarchism and Marxist-Leninism. Revolution doesn't come from seizing state power and using it for different ends, because the state form itself captures and neutralizes revolutionary force. Instead, revolution must work like the war machine, maintaining its exteriority to the state, its smooth space operations, its nomadic mode of organization. This means molecular revolution, not molar overthrow. It means finding lines of flight from within existing assemblages, rather than imagining a great rupture that will inaugurate something entirely new. Every assemblage contains both lines that hold it together and lines that pull it apart. Revolutionary practice involves intensifying the lines of deterritorialization, pushing them past the point where the assemblage can re-territorialize, while simultaneously constructing new assemblages on different planes. The final plateau on smooth and striated space demonstrates how these two modes interpenetrate everywhere. Technology can be seen as embroidery and patchwork, music as rhythm, harmony, and melody, the sea as navigation, mathematics as metric and non-metric multiplicity. In each domain, smooth and striated operate as two tendencies that mix in varying proportions. Embroidery operates in smooth space, following the material's own variations, while weaving operates in striated space, organizing threads according to a predetermined grid. patchwork assemblages heterogeneous pieces in smooth space, while quilting organizes them into geometric patterns in striated space. The crucial insight is that you can't simply celebrate smooth space and demonize striated space. Every smoothing produces new striations, and every striation contains pockets of smoothness. The sea became striated, but submarines open new smooth spaces. The city grid gets deterritorialized by drift, by practices of flânery and psychogeography. Capitalism itself operates through endless cycles of deterritorialization and re-territorialization, smoothing and striating according to the needs of accumulation. A Thousand Plateaus refuses to offer political prescriptions or philosophical conclusions. It provides instead a conceptual toolkit, a set of ways to analyze assemblages, map their lines, identify their singular points, trace their becomings. The book's difficulty lies not in specialized jargon, though there's plenty of that, but in how it demands a different kind of reading, a rhizomatic reading that doesn't proceed linearly, but makes its own connections, its own map through the plateaus. You're invited to enter anywhere, to take what you need, to ignore what doesn't resonate, to combine concepts in ways the authors never imagined. This is philosophy as open system, as construction site rather than monument. Every concept is a tool, and tools are meant to be used, modified, combined with other tools for purposes their makers couldn't anticipate. The rhizome continues to grow. In the mid-1980s, after completing the Capitalism and Schizophrenia project with Guattari, Deleuze turned to cinema. Between 1983 and 1985, he published two substantial volumes that would transform film theory: Cinema 1, The Movement Image, and Cinema 2, The Time Image. These books were not film criticism in any conventional sense, nor were they attempts to apply philosophical concepts to analyze films. Instead, Deleuze proposed that cinema itself thinks, that it generates philosophical concepts through its own means, and that philosophy's task is to extract and articulate these concepts that cinema produces. The relationship between philosophy and cinema is one of mutual presupposition rather than application. Cinema doesn't illustrate philosophical ideas, it creates them. Deleuze organized his study around a fundamental distinction between the movement image, characteristic of classical cinema, and the time image, which emerged in the aftermath of World War II. This wasn't simply a historical progression, but a taxonomy of different regimes of signs that cinema makes available. Following Henry Bergson's philosophy of time and matter, Deleuze argued that reality itself is composed of images, understood not as representations of things, but as the immediate interaction of light and matter. An image, in this Bergsonian sense, is simply what appears, the set of actions and reactions between material bodies. We ourselves are images among other images, moving and being moved in an infinite network of material interactions. Cinema captures this reality of images in ways unavailable to static arts, like painting, or to time-based arts like literature, that unfold through symbolic language. The movement image corresponds to matter and perception, while cinema could potentially reveal duration and time directly. In Cinema 1, Deleuze distinguishes several varieties of movement image: perception images that show how things appear to a center of indetermination; affection images that capture intensive states on expressive surfaces, like the human face; action images that depict situations provoking reactions according to a sensory motor schema; and mental images or relation images that reflect on connections between images. Classical Hollywood cinema, Soviet montage, German Expressionism, and French Impressionism all work primarily through movement images, though each emphasizes different aspects and creates different effects. The sensory-motor schema is key to understanding the movement image. Characters in classical cinema perceive situations. These perceptions trigger affective states, and these effects motivate actions that modify the situation. The detective sees the crime scene, feels suspicion or determination, and pursues the criminal. The cowboy perceives the threat to the town, feels moral indignation, and confronts the outlaws. The romantic lead sees the beloved, feels desire, and pursues union. This circuit of perception, affection, action constitutes what Deleuze calls an organic regime, where everything connects purposefully to everything else, where causes produce effects that become causes in turn, where the whole remains totalized even as it changes. But something happened to cinema after World War II that disrupted this sensory-motor schema. The devastation of post-war Europe created situations and spaces observers no longer knew how to describe. Buildings both deserted and inhabited, cities undergoing demolition or reconstruction. Italian neorealism, with directors like Rossellini and De Sica, showed characters confronting situations that exceeded their capacity to react. They saw rather than acted. The little girl in Germany Year Zero wanders through rubble that offers no clear paths for action. The child in The Bicycle Thieves witnesses economic desperation that no individual action can resolve. These films present what Deleuze calls purely optical and sonic situations, op signs and son signs, images detached from motor extension. When the sensory-motor link breaks, something extraordinary happens. Time ceases to be subordinate to movement and reveals itself directly. In the movement image, time remains indirect, measured by the actions that unfold across it, serving as the medium through which causes produce effects. But in the time image, time itself becomes visible, audible, palpable. We see duration in its pure state, no longer hidden beneath the movements that traverse it. This direct presentation of time constitutes the time image, and it opens cinema to radically new possibilities. Deleuze explores time images through concepts like recollection images and dream images, though these remain ambiguous between movement and time images, as well as proper signs of the time image. The crystal image becomes perhaps his most important concept. A crystal of time occurs when the actual and the virtual become indiscernible, when we can no longer distinguish between present perception and virtual memory, between what is happening now and what might be a recollection or a fantasy. Orson Welles' films constantly create these crystalline structures where multiple temporal layers coexist simultaneously. In Citizen Kane, different testimonies about Kane's life contradict each other, creating incompossible versions of the same past. Which memory is true? The question becomes meaningless because the crystal reveals that the past is not a fixed thing we access, but a virtual dimension coexisting with every present. Alain Resnais pushes this even further in films like Last Year at Marienbad, where we cannot tell whether events took place last year, are happening now, or exist only as projections of desire. The past, the present, and the possible fold into each other. Memory is not storage in the brain, but a dimension of being. the virtual coexistence of all past states with the actual present. The crystal image makes this coexistence visible, showing how the present constantly splits into two directions, toward the past as it contracts into memory, and toward the future as it expands into new actuals. This brings us to what might be Deleuze's most radical claim about cinema, its discovery of what he calls the powers of the false. Traditional narrative cinema operates under what he terms the regime of truthful narration. Stories unfold organically according to causal logic. Characters maintain consistent identities. Flashbacks clearly indicate pastness through conventional markers, and the narrative voice remains reliable, even when films include unreliable narrators or twist endings. They ultimately restore truth by revealing what really happened. The detective unmasks the killer. The mystery gets solved. Truth triumphs over deception. But time images institute a different regime, falsifying narration. Drawing on Nietzsche's critique of truth, Deleuze argues that the form of time itself puts truth into crisis. If the past coexists with the present as virtual rather than simply preceding it as actual, if multiple incompossible pasts can be equally real, if presents bifurcate into mutually exclusive futures, then the very notion of a true version of events collapses. The forger, the storyteller, the artist who invents rather than discovers, becomes more important than the truthful person who tries to reproduce what already exists. Orson Welles serves as Deleuze's prime example. In F for Fake, Welles explores the figure of Elmire de Ori, the famous forger of paintings, and asks what distinguishes the forger from the authentic artist. Both create images that don't reproduce pre-existing realities. Both falsify in the sense that they produce something new rather than copying something old. But where the forger depends on the category of the authentic to define himself against, where he remains parasitic on established standards of judgment, the true artist affirms the power of the false itself. The artist doesn't forge within existing categories, but invents new categories, creates new possibilities of truth rather than merely violating old ones. The forger depends on the truthful person, on experts who authenticate, on a system of judgment that sorts true from false. The artist transcends this entire opposition. Nietzsche's concept of will to power reappears here as the will to metamorphosis, the capacity to create new values rather than serving existing ones. The artist is a forger under the power of the false, someone who recognizes that all truth is created, all identity is produced, all fixity is temporary stabilization of flows. But unlike the cynical forger who simply exploits this insight, the artist affirms it, uses the power of the false to generate new modes of existence. Cinema achieves this most completely when it abandons organic narration for crystalline narration. Instead of characters with stable identities pursuing clear goals through coherent causal chains, we get what Deleuze calls serial or simultaneous presents that don't cohere into a single timeline. Alain Robbe-Grillet's films present contradictory versions of events without hierarchizing them or resolving them into truth. The Man Who Lies offers multiple, incompossible accounts of the same protagonist's wartime experiences, none of which can be verified, all of which produce reality effects. Reality becomes a function of narration rather than its foundation. Federico Fellini's films enter into this regime when they cease distinguishing memory from imagination, past from fantasy, lived experience from theatrical performance. In 812, the filmmaker protagonist moves seamlessly between childhood memories, present crises, imagined solutions, and fantasy sequences without clear markers. Which scenes really happened? The question misses the point. All of these virtual and actual dimensions coexist. All contribute equally to the crystal of time that constitutes a life. Beyond cinema, Deleuze applied these same concepts to literature and painting. In his book on Francis Bacon, he explored how painting could create sensations directly on the canvas, rather than representing pre-existing objects. Bacon's screaming popes don't represent screaming. They produce the sensation of screaming through color, line, and form. In his essay on Kafka, written with Guattari, he showed how minor literature operates through deterritorialization of major languages, creating new expressive possibilities from within dominant linguistic structures. In his book on Proust, he argued that In Search of Lost Time discovers signs in the world that force involuntary memory and thinking, that the protagonist learns not through voluntary effort, but through encounters with signs that compel interpretation. What connects all these artistic engagements is Deleuze's conviction that art doesn't reproduce or represent, but produces. It creates sensations, effects, and percepts that exceed the individuals who generate them and those who receive them. A novelist creates characters who are not people, but assemblages of affects. A painter creates sensations that are not feelings belonging to anyone. A filmmaker creates time images that don't belong to any consciousness, but present duration itself. Art extracts a block of sensations from the flow of lived experience, a compound of percepts and affects that stands alone, that persists beyond the moment of its creation. This is why art matters philosophically. If philosophy creates concepts and science creates functions, art creates these blocks of sensation, these monuments that don't commemorate anything but affirm the power of creation itself. The three practices, art, philosophy, and science, operate on a common plane of immanence, but produce irreducibly different kinds of thought. None has priority over the others. Philosophy needs art not to illustrate its concepts, but to encounter different modes of thinking, different ways of grappling with chaos, and extracting from it not truth or knowledge, but new possibilities of experience. Cinema taught Deleuze about time, not because he applied his philosophy of time to film, but because cinema discovered time through its own means, through its unique capacity to present movement and duration directly, rather than through symbolic mediation. The crystal image is cinema's concept, not philosophy's, even though philosophy can articulate and extend it. 29 years after Deleuze's death, his influence continues to proliferate across disciplines in ways that would have pleased him, since his philosophy was always oriented toward the production of new concepts rather than the preservation of canonical texts. Deleuze's work is cited by researchers in architecture, urban studies, geography, film studies, musicology, anthropology, gender studies, literary studies, and other fields, testament to the rhizomatic spread of his ideas beyond philosophy's traditional boundaries. But this influence has been uneven, contested, and at times deeply misunderstood. Understanding both the genuine transformations Deleuze's work has enabled and the ways it's been misappropriated or diluted remains crucial for evaluating his legacy. In continental philosophy itself, Deleuze emerged as a central figure in what came to be called French theory, alongside Foucault, Derrida, and Lacan. But where those thinkers focused primarily on language, power, and subjectivity, Deleuze offered something different, an affirmative ontology of production and becoming that refused the negativity characterizing much post-structuralist thought. His insistence on immanence, on staying within the plane of what is rather than appealing to transcendent grounds or absent origins, provided an alternative to both phenomenology's residual idealism and structuralism's hidden codes. This orientation toward immanence has proven especially influential for post-humanist philosophy, which seeks to dismantle human exceptionalism and think through our entanglements with non-human forces and entities. Deleuze's anti-transcendence approach, his rejection of Cartesian dualism, and his conception of bodies as dynamic compositions provide a rich theoretical framework for questioning anthropocentric thought and reimagining the complex relationships between human and non-human entities. Post-human theorists like Rosi Braidotti have drawn extensively on Deleuzian concepts to develop what she calls nomadic subjectivity, a model of selfhood that is multiple, processual, and distributed across human and non-human networks, as positions that insist on the equal yet distinct powers of mind and body, and the urgent need to dismantle human privilege and exceptionality. Immanence and posthumanism reveal concepts for rethinking established notions of being, thought, experience, and life. The body without organs becomes a way to think embodiment beyond the organized subject. Becoming animal provides resources for theorizing our continuity with other species, and assemblage theory offers tools for analyzing the heterogeneous collectives that compose contemporary life. But posthumanism also reveals tensions within Deleuzian thought. While Deleuze and Guattari's celebration of nomadism and deterritorialization speaks to desires for mobility and transformation, critics from post-colonial perspectives have noted how these concepts can unconsciously reproduce colonial narratives that romanticize indigenous peoples as nomadic others while ignoring the violence of actual displacement and the value of territorial belonging. The question becomes, can Deleuzian concepts be deployed in ways that genuinely challenge rather than reinforce existing power relations? This requires careful attention to context and a willingness to transform the concepts themselves rather than applying them mechanically. In architecture and urban theory, Deleuze's impact has been enormous and controversial. Following the publication of The Fold in 1988, architects seized on concepts like the fold, the smooth and the striated, and the rhizome to theorize new approaches to design enabled by digital technologies. Greg Lynn edited an issue of Architectural Design magazine in 1993 entitled Folding in Architecture that sought to embed the ideas of Deleuze into a new architectural theory using the emerging digital technologies of the time, primarily calculus-based three-dimensional modeling tools. This sparked what became known as digital architecture or parametric design, where complex curved forms could be generated through computational processes rather than traditional drawing methods. But the architectural appropriation of Deleuze often involved significant misreadings. When Deleuze spoke of movement, architects thought he was referring to dislocation between 2 points happening in a space-time interval. And when he was speaking of a body, they thought he was referring to a subject's body. The fold became reduced to a formal strategy for creating wavy surfaces rather than understood as Leibniz's concept of infinite differentiation. The rhizome became a metaphor for networked connectivity rather than a challenge to hierarchical organization. These simplifications produced what critics call blob architecture, spectacular biomorphic forms that use Deleuzian vocabulary but often serve corporate and state power rather than challenging it. More sophisticated engagements have emerged in recent years, particularly around questions of sustainability, participatory design, and the politics of urban space. Architects and urbanists now draw on assemblage theory to analyze how buildings, infrastructure, policies, inhabitants, and environments compose complex ecologies rather than stable objects. The concept of smooth space informs practices of tactical urbanism that work within and against the striated space of planning regulations and property regimes. The body without organs suggests ways to think about adaptive architecture that responds to intensive uses rather than imposing predetermined functions. In film studies, Deleuze's cinema books established an entirely new way of thinking about moving images. Rather than treating films as representations to be decoded or as expressions of directorial vision, Deleuze showed how cinema itself thinks through its images, how it creates concepts through montage, framing, and temporal manipulation. This opened film theory beyond semiotic and psychoanalytic approaches that had dominated the discipline, allowing scholars to attend to the effective and intensive dimensions of cinematic experience. The concepts of the movement image and time image, the crystal image, and the powers of the false have become standard tools for analyzing how films produce and transform perception. Beyond cinema, these concepts have proven useful for analyzing other time-based media, from video games to virtual reality to social media feeds. The question of how digital technologies create new regimes of time and perception, how they intensify or diminish our capacities to think and act, increasingly draws on Deleuzian frameworks. The way social media platforms modulate affect, the way algorithmic recommendation systems create filter bubbles, the way streaming services change our relationship to narrative time. These phenomena invite analysis through concepts of assemblage, control, and the production of subjectivity that Deleuze theorized. In political theory, Deleuze and Guattari's work on micropolitics, lines of flight, and the war machine has influenced autonomous Marxism, anarchist theory, and various strands of radical activism. The concept of molecular revolution suggests that transformative change happens not through seizing state power, but through creating new forms of life, new modes of organization, new practices of resistance that operate beneath or beside official politics. This has proven attractive to social movements from Occupy to contemporary mutual aid networks that seek alternatives to both state socialism and capitalist markets. However, the politics of Deleuze and Guattari remain deeply contested. Their apparent celebration of capitalism's deterritorializing power in Anti Oedipus was controversially interpreted as accelerationism. The idea that we should intensify capitalism's destructive tendencies rather than resist them. While this reading oversimplifies their position, it points to real ambiguities in how deterritorialization relates to emancipation. Not all lines of flight lead somewhere worth going. Some end in suicide, fascism, or nihilistic destruction. The challenge for contemporary political uses of Deleuze involves distinguishing productive from destructive deterritorializations, revolutionary from reactionary investments of desire. In feminist and queer theory, concepts of becoming woman and the body without organs have generated both enthusiasm and critique. Becoming woman offers resources for thinking beyond fixed gender categories, for understanding identity as processual rather than essential. But feminist critics have asked whether becoming woman risks appropriating women's experience while actually remaining invested in masculine positions of mobility and transgression. Does becoming woman require first occupying a majoritarian male position? Can women themselves become women, or only men seeking to escape their identities? These questions have prompted careful rereading that attend to how concepts function differently, depending on who deploys them and in what contexts. Queer theorists have found Deleuze particularly generative for thinking desire outside the Oedipal family and psychoanalytic models of lack. The concept of desiring production allows for understanding sexuality as creative force rather than as structured by prohibition and sublimation. Assemblage theory provides ways to analyze how sexual practices, identities, institutions, and discourses compose without reducing sexuality to expression of a deep truth about the self. The body without organs resonates with transgender and non-binary experiences of embodiment that resist organization into culturally normative forms. In cognitive science and neuroscience, some researchers have drawn connections between Deleuze's philosophy and contemporary theories of brain function, particularly work on neural networks, emergence, and distributed cognition. The brain as rhizome rather than hierarchical processor, thought as assemblage of heterogeneous processes rather than unified rational subject. These ideas align with computational and enactivist approaches that emphasize how mind emerges from complex interactions rather than residing in a central executive. However, these connections remain speculative and contested, with critics warning against reducing Deleuze's philosophical concepts to empirical claims about brain function. The ecological implications of Deleuze's thought have become increasingly important as climate crisis intensifies. His philosophy of immanence refuses the nature-culture dualism that has underwritten extractive capitalism's treatment of the earth as inert resource. Assemblage theory provides frameworks for understanding how human activities compose with geological, atmospheric, and biological processes in what's been called the Anthropocene. The concept of smooth space helps theorize environmental politics that operate outside state management regimes. Yet here too, challenges emerge. Does Deleuze's vitalist ontology adequately account for extinction, exhaustion, and the material limits that constrain becomings? In literary studies, Deleuze's work on Kafka, Proust, and minor literature has transformed how scholars approach texts. Rather than interpreting literature as expressing hidden meanings or reproducing ideological structures, Deleuzian readings attend to how texts function as machines, how they produce affects and deterritorializations, how they create possibilities for thinking and living differently. Minor literature, literature that deterritorializes major languages from within, becomes a model for cultural production under conditions of domination. This has proven especially influential for post-colonial literary theory. and for thinking about diaspora, translation, and cultural hybridity. Perhaps most broadly, Deleuze has contributed to what might be called a process philosophy renaissance. Against the substance ontologies that dominated Western philosophy from Aristotle through analytic metaphysics, process philosophers, including Whitehead, Bergson, and now increasingly Deleuze, insist that becoming is primary, that what appears as stable entities are actually dynamic processes temporarily stabilized. This shift from being to becoming, from things to events, from representations to productions, characterizes not just Deleuzian thought, but a wider intellectual movement spanning philosophy, science studies, social theory, and cultural analysis. The limitations and risks of Deleuze's influence also deserve acknowledgement. His work can be appropriated for techno-utopianism that celebrates disruption and innovation without attending to who benefits and who suffers from destabilization. The difficulty of his prose creates barriers that can reinforce academic elitism rather than opening thought to wider publics. The emphasis on creativity and experimentation can obscure the material constraints and systemic violences that structure contemporary life. The celebration of mobility and deterritorialization can mask its own privileges. Not everyone can afford to celebrate nomadism when displacement means precarity and exposure. Yet Deleuze's philosophy continues to matter precisely because it refuses easy answers, because it provides conceptual tools rather than political programs, because it insists that thinking must be adequate to the complexity and creativity of reality itself. In an era of ecological crisis, technological transformation, and political upheaval, we need philosophies that can grasp multiplicity, process, and emergence. We need concepts for understanding how systems change, how the new enters the world, how alternatives become possible. This is what Deleuze offers. Not solutions, but orientations. Not truths, but tools for navigating a world that remains perpetually open to transformation. The rhizome continues to grow, sprouting connections we cannot anticipate, creating effects in domains Deleuze never imagined. This too would have pleased him. Philosophy succeeds not when it achieves closure, but when it opens new problems, new lines of inquiry, new practices of thought and life. That opening remains Deleuze's most enduring gift.